Okay, hello, welcome. My name is Dr. Charlie Hall. I'm a lecturer in modern European history in the School of History at Kent. And today I want to talk a little bit about propaganda, to give a taster of what lectures might be like if you were to study history at Kent. So propaganda is something that crops up in lots of the modules that we offer at Kent, and certainly if you were to study any military history or modern political or social history, including the history of Germany or Russia during the 20th century, elements of propaganda would come up. So I think this will give you a flavour, at least, of what it would be like to be a history student at Kent. So the first question I think we need to address is, what is propaganda? We hear this word a lot, it crops up in the media an awful amount, but what do we mean by it? So a kind of working dictionary definition is that it is a form of communication aimed towards influencing the attitude of a population towards some cause or position. That's useful to a point, but it doesn't give us a lot without context. And I think we need to think carefully about these other questions if we are to understand what propaganda is and how it can be used. So we need to think about who's utilising it, which groups, which individuals might use propaganda, who are they aiming that propaganda at. It's not always at the whole of society, sometimes it targets specific groups. What techniques do the propagandists employ to get their message across? And then some slightly more complex questions. So is it necessary? Do we need propaganda? Can society function without it? And as a kind of secondary point to that, is it positive or negative? I think propaganda is often considered a dirty word. We associate it with totalitarian regimes like the Nazis. But perhaps propaganda itself can be rescued from that interpretation and thought of it as a more neutral term. And then critically, I think for us as historians, what can we learn from it? If we look at a piece of propaganda from 1920s Germany or from 1960s Russia, what can we actually learn about those periods and about those countries at that time from looking at it? So I think that's why it's such an interesting historical tool. So I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of some examples of propaganda and get you to think about some of those themes and key skills as well that we can pick up from looking at these types of sources. So we might think of propaganda as a modern 20th century thing, but in fact it goes back almost as far back as recorded human history in one form or another. So here is a coin bearing the head of Alexander the Great, but not minted by Alexander the Great. It was minted by one of his successors, a man called Lysimachus. Now this is interesting. He's using the imagery of Alexander to suggest that he is his natural successor, that he continues the greatness with which Alexander was associated. And also we might not necessarily think of coins as propaganda items, but of course they represent wealth, which means they represent power. They're also ubiquitous, though we carry them around with us all the time. So we see them on a regular basis, and British currency, it carries propaganda as well today. Bearing the Queen's head as a unifying figure, but also bearing Great Britain's through history. So we have banknotes with figures like Jane Austen and Charles Darwin on them. Those represent who we consider to be the kind of greatest members of our nation from history. So you're portraying a certain message, you're conducting propaganda in that way. Moving forward a little bit, into Britain in the early modern era, a famous portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, from 1588, and there are some key points that we can identify from this image. So at the back, out of the two windows, we have the British ships, the British Navy sailing on calm seas, but with full sails and in good order. And on the other side, we have Spanish ships and stormy seas clearly sinking. So that's obviously a message about the Spanish Armada, which this portrait followed almost directly after. Equally, we have her hand resting on the globe as a symbol of kind of imperial conquest, and particularly you see her hand is resting on the Americas, which is the area where Elizabethan imperial conquest was taking place most actively. And also we can see that she's dressing in an outfit that contains pearls, which are symbols of chastity and of purity, representing her as the virgin queen, as a woman who was married to her country and would not be tamed by any suitor. So art as propaganda, I think, is important as well, particularly in an era before mass media. And we see that again here, jumping forward again into the Napoleonic period, and a very famous painting of Napoleon, which again uses certain imagery that is perhaps a little subtle. It's not as clear propaganda as text on a bold background, but there is imagery here that we can analyse as well. So we have the finger pointing forwards, a sign of action, a sign of forward and upward motion. We have the use of colour as being very important here, and we have the setting as well. He's in the Alps. He's moving away from a chasm in the ground. He's moving upwards and forwards, but also crucially evoking that memory of Hannibal, the great classical military commander who led his armies over the Alps to attack Rome. So we have these ideas of using history as propaganda, which I'll return to in a moment, using historical examples to make yourself look stronger. We saw it with the first source, with Lysimachus using Alexander's imagery to make that connection, and we see it here again with Napoleon. But it's subtle. You have to be educated enough. You have to understand the references that are being made here. It's relying on a certain amount of knowledge from the audience, and most propaganda does that. Most effective propaganda engages with what audiences would already know. So if we jump forward a little bit now and get into the 20th century and think about when propaganda, and we talk about the 20th century as an era of people power, when democracy expanded, but also mass movements that demanded the support of the population, it was necessary to expand propaganda in a major way. So we see in the Russian Civil War, immediately following the Russian Revolution, we have the Bolshevik propaganda train taking messages across a vast country and showing that connection with a relatively modern technology of rail travel to cover huge distances in what was, in many parts, a very backwards country. In the Cold War, we see the use of radio to transmit across a border, across the Iron Curtain, send the messages from the US-funded Radio Free Europe into the Eastern Bloc. Similarly, about if it's an issue of transmitting your propaganda into a piece of territory which you do not hold or control, leaflet drops which date back far beyond the Iraq War and still continue to some extent to this day. And if we think about really the modern era, the 21st century, we can think about social media as an enormous propaganda tool, not least because anyone can have access to it. You don't need to be a government minister or a party leader to access social media. And here we have we come into the topic of fake news here with a video that was false but was shared by the leader of Britain First, a far-right organisation in the UK, and then retweeted by Donald Trump, who has a huge number of followers. And the problem with this level of propaganda, of course, is that it can't be verified, so it may not be factually accurate, but if it's shared widely, it can have a huge effect. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have this idea of history being used as propaganda. So here's a poster, a Nazi campaign poster, where Hitler is shown as the next step in a process of great German leaders. Frederick the Great, Otto von Bismarck, Paul von Hindenburg, these are great German leaders, respected by the German nation. Hitler sees himself as the next step in that message. Also interesting that he refers to himself as a soldier, calling in that military credibility as well. Here again, UKIP, going back to 2009, utilising Churchill, again held up often as a great British leader to give their campaign some legitimacy. Of course, famously, Churchill was in strong favour of a united and integrated Europe, so this is a deliberate misrepresentation of history, which can be a very potent tool in propaganda. And then very recently, indeed, this idea of using the Second World War as a way of restoring British greatness, if we like. So the idea that Britain had won 2 world wars would no longer be able to be dictated to, perhaps by Germany as part of the European Union. So campaigns often use historical examples or historical precedent as a way to give themselves credibility and legitimacy. And of course that can be flipped around. We can think of propaganda as history as well. So this is how we can use propaganda to understand the past. So here we have a poster from Nazi Germany for promoting a film that they produced, which was called The Eternal Jew, and essentially laid out all the horrors of the Jewish people and why it was so necessary for the Nazi regime to try and eliminate them. And I think that tells us an awful lot about the anti-Semitism that was baked into the Third Reich. Here we have a US venereal disease precaution poster sent out to troops and to military bases during the Second World War. And this tells us a lot about understanding of gender norms at the time as well, the way that women were portrayed. There's a range of these posters, and in every case the woman is portrayed as the spreader of the disease, the carrier of the disease, and the men are innocent victims who fall prey to her sexual predation, which is interesting in that at a time when women were considered to be more sexually conservative, it's flipped on its head in this way to make women out as the villain in these pieces, and that tells us an awful lot about military medicine, but also about perceptions of gender in the past. And again, just to consider the present day as well, these posters that I'm sure many of you will have seen at transport hubs and elsewhere, with the slogan, "See it, say it, sorted." And for future historians who look back at this period to want to understand what were the dominant ideas of our time, the fear of terrorism and the fear of the unknown that came with that, I think we could be ascertained from looking at a source such as this. So hopefully that very brief tour has given you a sense of how we can look at propaganda and learn from it as historians, and also perhaps how we can be more mindful of the messages that are circulated to us in the present day, and think about how our historical skills can help us better understand the world we live in today, which I think is one of the great reasons to study history. And I'm sure that if you were to come and study history at Kent, you would go away well equipped to engage more actively with current affairs and with the contemporary world. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you at Kent sometime soon.